What's going on, guys? We're back and we're breaking down UFC 281, Adesanya versus Pereira. Obviously, I missed the previous card, and this one is getting dropped a little early here, but that's because I'm actually going to be at MSG for this event. Long story short, there was a lot of moving parts to make this happen. I had a lot of work to do. Only had time to really break down one of these cards, and the decision was easy, right? 281 is just an insanely stacked card, top to bottom. I'm actually pretty confident that this card's going to deliver. There's a lot of action fighters on this card, a lot of really good matchups. The crowd and the energy is going to be insane. I feel like that's really going to feed into the frenzy of some of these matchups. So I really do think this card's going to deliver. I think we're going to have a ton of exciting fights on this card. So without further ado, let's get right into the breakdowns for this card. And in the curtain jerker, we have Carlos Ulberg versus Nicolae Negumereanu. And Ulberg's the minus 120 favorite. Negumereanu's the plus 100 underdog. We'll start with Ulberg, slight favorite here. Ulberg, I do think, is a decent striker, but I feel like maybe the market is still a bit low on him because of a couple earlier performances in his career. Outside of the Nchukwi fight where he did get that early knockout, he's kind of dropped the ball before. He didn't look particularly great against Fabio Cherant. Cherant, obviously, just a very low-level fighter, and Ulberg never really put his stamp on that fight. He kind of just coasted in that fight. Really could have showed out a little bit more. And then before that, there was the Nzechukwu performance where he kind of punched himself out, ended up, gassing out and eventually getting finished in that second round. And typically he does come in as the favorite, so I feel like maybe the perception around him is, he's a bit of a bed shitter, and that he's really only in the UFC because of Izzy, which could be true, but at the end of the day, I do still think that Ulberg is a solid fighter, man. I do think that he's a decent striker with good footwork, good cage craft. He's quick. He's a decent athlete. He's got some power in his hands. He slipped up against Nzechukwu. I feel like that was a bit of his greenness showing through. Him maybe not really respecting his opponent, going in there thinking, he could just put hands on Nzechukwu and get him out of there. Punched himself out in that fight, but was able to put together a solid 3-round performance in the fight after that. So I do think that Ulberg has got a lot of tools to succeed here, on top of the fact that I feel like he's a decently skilled fighter overall. And the thing is, I feel like the UFC still is trying to build him up. I feel like they're still giving him somewhat favorable matchups, and I do think that Negumereanu's a somewhat favorable matchup for Ulberg in the spot. Obviously, Negumereanu, a very tough guy, very durable, someone that, if you're going to, blow your load on him early, he's definitely going to punish you later. But Negumereanu, in my opinion, is not a really good fighter. I think he's pretty basic. He did put together a nice little win streak, but I feel like it's a very shaky win streak. He's got a win over Pereira, who potentially a fraud. Nzechukwu, very close fight, arguably lost that fight, and then Villanueva and Kimura, just very, very low level guys. Obviously, you could say Ulberg's pretty low level, not very proven, but between the two, I do think that Ulberg is going to be the much quicker fighter, much more technical with the striking, much better footwork. Negumereanu, he's someone who will move forward, but he's very plotty in there. He's tough. He's willing to take one to give one. But it just leads to him taking way too much damage. And overall, I just feel that Negumereanu is just going to be a little too slow and a little too hittable against a striker like Ulberg. I think that Ulberg's just got way better footwork. He's just the way more technical fighter. On top of that, he's going to be a bit taller and longer, so he's going to be able to leverage that pretty well. He's the better athlete. And I do actually think that Ulberg, I do think he's got the cardio to put on a solid 3-round striking performance against Negumereanu. I know people are going to look back at the Nzechukwu fight, but the fact of the matter is that he still was able to land over 140 significant strikes against Nzechukwu over the course of about 2.5 rounds. So that was just an insane pace that Ulberg was setting, one that wasn't very sustainable, but I feel like with just proper pacing, he could definitely maintain that sort of output over the course of 3 rounds. So I feel if Ulberg is able to pace himself well in this fight, I feel like he could pretty cleanly outstrike Negumereanu here. I just think Negumereanu he's just too hittable, and it's not like Negumereanu's some insane pace fighter either, right? His output isn't actually that high, and I just don't think he's going to force Ulberg to really kick it into that next gear. So I think this is a pretty good spot for Ulberg. I think he can get it done by decision. I think the knockout is potentially live as well. Negumereanu is extremely tough, but I do think Ulberg's got decent power, and with the striking defense that Negumereanu has, I don't know how many shots like that he could be taken from someone like Ulberg over the course of 3 rounds, but given the durability of Negumereanu and the fact that Ulberg has punched himself out before, I wouldn't be surprised if Ulberg takes a more measured approach and doesn't really force a finish, even if he does potentially have Negumereanu hurt. So the official pick, I'm going to go with Ulberg to win by decision. I see him just being able to pick Negumereanu apart over the course of 3 rounds. So give me Ulberg by decision. And moving along, we have Montel Jackson versus Julio Arce, and Jackson's the -205 favorite. Arce's the +175 underdog. And we'll start with Arce, who is going to be the more veteran striker coming in here. He's got very slick boxing, good output, good takedown defense. He's 2-1 since moving down to 135, with his only loss being the Song Yadong. So, pretty respectable loss there. But overall, it does seem like he's really easing into this 135 division. But it's funny because part of the reason I think he said he moved down to 135 was he felt like he was giving up a lot of size at 145, and he felt that his speed and his skill would translate down to 135. And he does have the frame of a 135er, but the UFC's not doing him a ton of favors here because he's going up against Jackson, who is definitely one of the bigger guys in the division. I mean, frame-wise, he's probably bigger than a lot of 145ers, but Jackson, 5'10", 75-inch reach, very long for the division, very well-rounded also. He's a little low volume on the feet, but it does look like he's got some power in his hands. He's got a pretty absurd knockdown rate, which it is a little overinflated, from the JP Bays fight, but even before that, he has been able to hurt guys. And on top of that, he is a capable wrestler. But if I'm being honest here, I do think that Jackson is a little overrated. I'm looking at his overall body of work at the UFC level, and really outside of the Kelleher win, I don't think he's really got that many good wins. And even against Kelleher, I'm not sure how much you could really take away from that performance. I mean, getting a win over Kelleher is very respectable, but with Kelleher, he oftentimes folds against, I'd say, decent prospects. He'll win against lower level guys, but he does have a tendency to give up the neck and give up a submission early in a fight against better fighters. So I guess credit to Jackson there, but outside of that, the wins really aren't great. I mean, guys like JP Bays, Jesse Strader, Felipe Colares, Andre Sukumtat, just pretty bottom of the barrel guys. He is able to handle business in there, but a lot of the time Jackson's coming in as a massive favorite, and I feel like he just hasn't really lived up to, I guess, the expectations. That said, I do think that Jackson's got a lot of tools to succeed here. He's going to be the more well-rounded fighter coming into this fight. Arce is primarily just a boxer in there, whereas with Jackson, he can strike, he can wrestle. On top of that, Jackson, he's going to be the much taller and longer guy. Arce is going to have to find a way to work around the range of Jackson. Arce hasn't really faced anyone as big as Jackson either, even at 145. He did go up against Julian Erosa, who is a pretty tall, lanky guy, but Erosa's not really a guy that uses his length all that well. Arce or Erosa very much a pressure in your face sort of fighter, whereas with Jackson, he actually does use his length pretty well. And again, on top of that, he does have the wrestling to mix in. So if it does look like Arce may be pulling ahead in the striking, I think Montel's got that safety valve in the wrestling he could fall back to. On the feet, I do think that technically speaking, Arce's the better boxer, but I feel like he's just got so much else working against him. I'm not sure how he's going to quite deal with the reach of Jackson. And on top of that, I think that Jackson's the heavier hitter, so I feel like Jackson's got a little more knockdown upside and maybe even knockout upside in this fight. Jackson's also going to be the younger guy, entering his prime, so a lot of factors in favor of Jackson here. So as far as the pick goes, I do think Jackson is the side. I think he likely gets it done by decision. I don't know if the knockout is too likely for Jackson here. I feel like Jackson, even though he has power, doesn't have a ton of finishing instinct. He had Kolaris in pretty bad spots, was basically mauling him and wasn't able to get him out of there. He knocked JP Bays down 4 times and wasn't able to find the finish. So I don't know what the finishing instinct on Jackson's looking like. And, outside of the Arce, or for Arce, outside of the Song Yadong knockout, hasn't really shown a ton of chin concerns. So I feel like if Jackson gets it done, it'll likely be by decision. Keep it competitive on the feet, land some big shots, and then be able to mix in the wrestling to close out rounds and score that way as well. So I'm going to go with Jackson here, the younger and longer fighter with a few more paths to victory. So give me Jackson by decision. And next up, we have Mike Trizano versus Seung Choi. And Choi's the -160 favorite. Trizano's the +140 underdog. We'll start with the slight underdog in Trizano first. So Trizano, he is primarily a boxer, someone who does do a decent job of fighting behind the jab. He's got a nice little low kick that he'll throw. But overall, I do think his striking is pretty one-dimensional. I don't think he's doing anything crazy in there. He's kind of low output. He doesn't really put stamps in fights. And honestly, I think he is a bit of a coaster, right? Someone who, just doing enough to win, which is why, a lot of his fights end up being pretty close. He has struggled a bit with takedowns, outside of his last 2 fights. Trizano's opponents have had a decent amount of success taking him down and holding him there. However, it might not be a big issue here because he's going up against Seung Choi, who is primarily a striker also. Very crisp striking, good straight punches, pretty sneaky kicking game also. But the thing with Choi is, he has shown he can mix in the wrestling occasionally. Usually he doesn't when he's a little outgunned on the feet. But he did it against Zalal as well. It's not a massive part of his game, but I feel like if there's anyone in this fight to potentially break out the wrestling, it might be Choi, just because he's gone to it a little more. But taking a look at this matchup, I do think that Choi is the rightful favorite here. Overall on the feet, I just think that Trizano's a little too basic. The volume isn't quite there either. He doesn't really have the power to really back it up either. There's not a ton of wrestling upside from him either. So it's just a really tough sell on Trizano here, whereas with Choi, he's going to be the slightly taller and longer guy, so he's going to have a slightly, just natural advantage there. I feel like he's got a little more power as well. He's got a potential wrestling upside. We've actually seen him go to it in fights, whereas with Trizano, I feel like he hasn't really gone to there at all. I feel like with Trizano, he's barely doing enough to win in a lot of his fights. His wins, I think, are very close and competitive, somewhat controversial at times, whereas his losses are largely blowouts. So I feel like overall Choi might just have a little more upside here. However, I feel like it'll be a competitive enough fight that I probably won't want any action in this fight. Because at the end of the day, I feel like this is largely going to be a striking affair. And while I do slightly favor Choi, I don't think this will be an outclass or anything. I don't think Choi's going to come in here and completely blow Trizano out of the water. And, despite what I've said about Trizano, he does have a tendency to make fights a lot closer than they should be. And in a fight that is largely going to be a striking affair, I wouldn't be surprised if it was close enough that, we see the judges end up giving rounds to Trizano and him winning another very controversial decision. So I'm going to pick Choi to win here, but I wouldn't be surprised if an upset happened. It's going to be a striking affair, and I don't think Choi's like levels above Trizano or anything. I just don't really like the output and the optics that Trizano brings in terms of the striking. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Choi, probably by decision. It's kind of tough because Trizano, he is coming off of a knockout, and he did get his bell rung quite a bit in his last fight, and Choi is someone who I think can crack. So I feel like the knockout is live, but I feel like this will also be a somewhat low volume fight. Neither guy really pushes an insane pace. So, I don't think they'll be like, just trading and brawling in the pocket or anything. I feel like if a knockout were to happen, it'd have to be from a pretty clean shot, and I don't know if that's going to happen here. So I'm going to go with Choi to win by decision. And in the next fight, we have Karolina Kowalkiewicz versus Silvana Gómez Juárez, and this is a pick 'em fight, so minus 110 both ways. But I mean, just talk about an absolute red flag of a fight. We have Kowalkiewicz, who, she's going to be the more veteran level fighter, a lot more tenured, a lot more UFC experience, but the fact is she's getting her ass beat pretty badly in a lot of her losses. Her only relevant win was against Rose back in the day. Rose, as we all know, a bit of a head case, and that was a long time ago. And quite frankly, I just feel that Kowalkiewicz has looked pretty bad lately. Even in her most recent win against Herrig, I don't think she looked particularly great. And Herrig, in my opinion, is kind of washed as well. So not a particularly great look on the Kowalkiewicz end, but it is worth mentioning, though, this is against UFC level fighters, fighters who are ranked, fighters who have kind of gone on to prove themselves, right? You look at the loss streak, Jessica Andrade, high-level fighter, was the champ at one point. Michelle Waterson, a very solid UFC-level fighter, very proven. Alexa Grasso, quickly climbing up the rankings, is probably on track for a title shot soon. Yan Xiaonan, solid fighter, solid top 5-ish fighter. And then Jessica Penne, that was a bit of a boneheaded mistake on Kowalkiewicz's part, just diving into the guard of Penne and gets armbarred there. Not a fight that is really translatable here anyways. But I feel like that is important because we're talking about Silvana Gómez Juárez here, who, while she does have a few highlight reel wins, she does have a few knockdowns and knockouts. She does have power. She does have the striking. I won't deny that. It is against some very, very low-level fighters. You look at the fighters she's been able to knock down and knock out in there, girls like Demopoulos and Nali Yang. Both of these fighters are grapplers, two fighters who really don't have any sort of stand-up. They're very bad defensively. They're walking into punches. So, yeah, I don't know if you could really put too much stock in those performances. And even against Demopoulos, where, she was able to hurt Demopoulos really badly. Demopoulos was able to still find the armbar in that fight. And then in the Godinez fight, I think a lot of people remember Godinez taking Gómez Juárez down and just mauling her on the mat. But even on the feet, Godinez was lighting Juárez Gómez up. So I feel like Gómez Juárez is getting maybe a little overrated just based off of a couple of moments against grapplers. I mean, I get that Kowalkiewicz is 37 and, she hasn't looked good lately, but Gómez Juárez is 37 also. So, not a spring chicken on her end. And even on the regionals, she's getting beat by, I'd say, pretty bottom of the barrel UFC fighters in Lipski and in Patello. So I'm just not really sold on this Silvana Gómez Juárez lady. And I mean, not that I'm sold on Kowalkiewicz either, but I feel like the UFC experience does have to count for something. And this technically is, I'd say, a step up in competition for Gómez Juárez. Whereas for Kowalkiewicz, this is, I guess, a step down, compared to all of Kowalkiewicz's previous opponents, minus maybe Herrig or something. But even then, at least Herrig has kind of competed at the UFC level, whereas Gómez Juárez is still a bit of an unknown. And quite frankly, I don't think her ceiling is all that high. But at the end of the day, I'm just not super high on this fight in general. I think it's a pretty low-level fight. Lots of red flags on either side, not one I want to get really invested in, if I'm being honest. But as far as a pure pick goes, I got to go with Kowalkiewicz. I think it really just comes down to the UFC experience, and that Kowalkiewicz has kind of been operating on a slightly higher level as opposed to Silvana Gómez Juárez. So I'm going to go with Kowalkiewicz to win by decision. And next up, we have Ottman Azaitar versus Matt Frevola. Frevola is the minus 130 favorite. Azaitar is the plus 110 underdog. And I feel like this is a pretty straightforward breakdown. When it comes to guys like Azaitar who are pretty front-loaded with their win condition, I feel like it's pretty straightforward because with a guy like Azaitar, we kind of know what he's going to do. In all of his fights, he starts out extremely hot, very explosive, very quick starter, someone who's going to go in there and just look to wing hooks and take your head off right from the start. I think all but 2 of his fights have ended in the first round. I think he's got like one decision win and another finish that was either in the second or third round. So most of his wins are early in the first. He can go out there and just bomb on somebody. And going into this fight, I do think that he can come in here and take Frevola's head off, because Frevola, he does have, I think, a pretty shaky chin. He's been knocked out before. He's been hurt pretty badly in a lot of fights. And Frevola is someone who will come in here and look to swing with opponents, right? We've seen him do it before. Just come in and look to brawl and trade with opponents. He's been clipped and knocked out before. It's worked out in his favor sometimes, but, he is someone who can put himself in these 50-50 situations. So with a guy like Frevola, we have someone who potentially has got bad fight IQ with a bad chin, which is a pretty scary combination, but Frevola, he does have the wrestling and grappling to fall back to. We've seen him go to it. We've seen him win decisions going to it. And I feel like that's the smart thing to do here. I feel like it would likely be the path of least resistance for Frevola. He could definitely come out early and look to bang with Azaitar, but I feel like that would be a pretty bad idea. I think you're kind of giving Azaitar his only win condition in doing so. Frevola, he is training with Aljo. He's got a great room of grapplers he's working with. It's a part of his game, so, I don't see why he wouldn't go to the wrestling here. We haven't really seen Azaitar gas too badly. He's been able to find finishes in most of his fights, but I feel like I could go out on a limb and say that the pace that he fights at isn't very sustainable. We've also seen his brother slow down a bit in fights, so the cardio thing could just be a family thing. So yeah, I kind of feel that if Azaitar isn't able to find the early finish against Frevola, we see Frevola likely take over in the second and third round. I feel that Azaitar is going to be pretty dangerous in like the first 3 or 4 minutes or so, but I do think that once Frevola is able to get his wrestling going, he'll really start to wear on the cardio of Azaitar. There's not going to be as much heat coming behind the shots. So as far as the pick goes, I do have to side with Frevola here. I think there's a pretty clear path for Frevola. I feel like if he is able to not get knocked out early, he likely will take over in the second and third rounds. And on top of that, I just like that I've seen Frevola go the distance in a 3-round fight at the UFC level on a number of occasions. He did win against Jalen Turner. He did win against Luis Pena. Did go the distance against Sarukian. So he has put together 3-round performances before. Whereas with Azaitar, that's not really the case. He's usually getting guys out of there within like the first minute and a half. And I don't think it's against the best guys either. Kama Worthy, very chinny guy, no longer with the promotion. Timu Pakalin, not entirely sure what happened to that guy, but he's not very good either. And then the rest of his wins are regional level wins against pretty mid to low tier guys, in my opinion. He still is a very dangerous fighter, and I wouldn't be completely surprised if he came out there and just knocked Frevola out early. Frevola really just does not have a good chin whatsoever, but if that knockout doesn't materialize for Azaitar, I think we see Frevola take over in the second and third round. So, official pick, I'm going to go with Frevola to win by round 3 TKO. I think what we see happen here is Azaitar maybe just get a little too fatigued, and we see Frevola get on top of him and just pound him out later in the fight. So, give me Frevola to win by round 3 knockout. And next up, we have Andre Petroski versus Wellington Turman. And Petroski's the minus 205 favorite. Turman's the plus 175 underdog. And we'll start with Petroski first. Pretty straightforward in terms of breaking down a Petroski fight, in my opinion. Petroski's a very aggressive grappler, very physical, very explosive. He's a good athlete. And he is a good wrestler and a good submission grappler as well. The issue is he just doesn't really have the cardio to sustain the style and the fight that he really wants to push, right? I know he does have a couple of round 3 finishes, but they're over guys like Huya Zhang and Michael Gilmore, who, in my opinion, are bottom of the barrel fighters, not UFC caliber guys. Arguably not even good regional fighters, in my opinion. So I don't know if you could look at those fights and say that Petroski has fixed his cardio issues, or that he doesn't have cardio issues or anything like that. But I do think that what makes this matchup so compelling is that they're matching Petroski up against Turman, who, if I'm being honest, I'm not really sure what he's good at. He's billed as a grappler, but he's out here, he's getting reversed by Carl Roberson, who is a kickboxer. Bruno Silva was able to reverse him and pound him out in round 1 against Serkinov. looks the best he's ever been. He's putting on an absolute clinic against Turman early. Turman was able to pull off the armbar a little later in the fight, but I think that's also just a function of Cirkunov kind of just choking in there, which he's prone to do in a lot of his fights. And really, just outside of that, I feel like Turman hasn't really shown that he's particularly great at anything. The striking's not much to write home about either. Obviously, he got knocked out by Andrew Sanchez. He's fighting somewhat competitively against Sam Alvey, which is a pretty bad look in my opinion. And I know the split decision was due to a point deduction, but the fact is, he never really pulled away in that fight against Alvey. But taking a look at this matchup, I do think that there is a path for Petroski. Petroski obviously is a very dangerous grappler early. Much more dangerous than I've given him credit for before. And watching Turman just get manhandled by Cirkunov early, I feel like Petroski can definitely have a success early. I think he might be able to find the finish. Petroski, obviously, a very dangerous submission grappler. He's got a very nasty squeeze on him. But, I do have questions as to how Petroski's going to look in that second and third round if he isn't able to find the finish. The only question here is, I don't know if Turman's the type of guy to be able to capitalize, because it does seem like Turman sometimes lacks the urgency to really put pressure and, aggression on opponents. So, even if Petroski is slowing down in there after that first round, I'm not entirely convinced that Turman is the guy to really punish him. I think he'll have opportunities. We saw in, I think it was the Gilmore fight, Petroski went pretty hard in that first round, was basically taking the whole second round off, but, Gilmore's just not a good enough fighter to really make Petroski work in there, not really threaten with much. Whereas with Turman, I feel like maybe he might be able to threaten a bit with his own grappling, and if, Petroski does start to tire out in there, Turman may be able to find a submission. And Turman, he is actually still a pretty young guy. He could be making improvements. He's training with guys like Glover. And honestly, I feel like if there's any legitimacy to his black belt, and if his corner's prepping him properly, I think Turman should be able to put up a lot more resistance than guys like Huiyao Zhang and Gilmore. So I feel like he's got opportunities to capitalize. I'm not sure if he will. But where it's priced at now, I definitely don't think I could get to the Petroski side. If anything, I'll probably look to play him to win in round one, maybe round one submission. That's typically how Petroski wins his fights. He's very aggressive early, almost to a fault, right? He's going to hunt the submission, but he does leave himself exposed in that second and third round when that submission doesn't materialize. So the official pick for this fight, I think I'm going to go with Turman. I know he's not a great fighter, and I'm not really high on him myself, but I just don't know if I can get to Petroski when most of his win equity is tied up in the early rounds. He's a known gasser, and if Turman is able to weather that first round against Petroski, he'll have, I think, an okay shot at making something happen in that second and third round. And, despite everything I've said about Turman, I do think he's actually going to be a step up in competition compared to all the other guys that Petroski's fought. Obviously, he's got wins over guys like Gilmore and Huiyao Zhang, and, an early submission against Maximov. But even Maximov, I think, is still somewhat unproven. But he was able to pull off an early sub, which usually is his win condition anyways. But overall, I do actually think that Petroski, or, Turman's going to be the best guy that Petroski's been in there. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how he stacks up against someone like Turman, who in theory should be able to offer a lot more resistance. But official pick, I'm going to go with Turman to win by round 2 submission. And in the next fight, we have Erin Blanchfield versus Molly McCann, and Blanchfield's the minus 425 favorite, McCann's the plus 355 underdog. And we'll start with the big favorite in Blanchfield. She's a very good grappler who I feel is riding a bit of hype. I feel that, she's kind of been on a rocket ship after the Maverick performance, where she was able to just pretty much ragdoll another, up-and-comer in Maverick. But Blanchfield, she does have good wrestling, really good grappling. She's got a variety of takedowns she'll go to. I've seen her hit trips, throws. She's got a nice single leg takedown, nice high crotch and lateral drop as well. Just very impressed overall with the variety of takedowns I've seen her hit. And of course, she's, very heavy on top, very aggressive there. Will hunt submissions, will look for ground and pound. and generally she is pretty good at, pushing the grappling. However, there is a path against Blanchfield, in my opinion. We did see her struggle a bit against Aldrich when she wasn't able to hit the takedowns. Aldrich was piecing her up on the feet. Obviously, Blanchfield was able to pull off the submission in the second round, but I do think that Blanchfield is still very reliant on having to hit takedowns to win fights. And she is going up against McCann, who is a come-forward striker, just a very tough fighter, very scrappy fighter who's willing to come forward and throw volume, get in your face, and just kind of scrap with you. McCann's got solid cardio, good output, and she does have a bit of wrestling upside as well. But historically, where McCann has struggled the most has been in the grappling. I don't think she's a terrible grappler by any means. I just think that McCann maybe seems to be a little physically weak in the grappling exchanges. A lot of grapplers that have wanted to take her down have had a ton of success doing so. They've been able to control her, even find the submission against her. You look at McCann's resume, all of her wins have really been against strikers, and all of her losses have been to grapplers. So I feel like this fight is pretty straightforward in that regards, and the bookies are kind of wise to it. The public's pretty wise to it as well. They're really making you pay with this minus 400 line on Blanchfield. But I feel like it is somewhat warranted. It's hard to ignore the tape on McCann. You watch her fight against Santos. Santos was able to kind of have her way with McCann. Granted, Santos was able to challenge for a title and was able to top time Shevchenko. So, you can't hold that against her too much, but, there are other performances of McCann that are a little troubling. Procopio was able to get on top of McCann and win in a lot of the grappling exchanges. Robertson back in the day was able to take McCann down and submit her. So I feel like the grappling is a pretty clear path against McCann. And so for that reason, I feel like the price is somewhat justified. I don't think there's too much value on it because I feel like best case scenario is we see Blanchfield just get on top of McCann and either finish her or just get enough top time to win a very dominant decision. But at the end of the day, this is women's MMA. Blanchfield is still pretty early in her career. We did see Aldrich take a round off Blanchfield, in her last fight. She was able to use her footwork, stay at distance, stuff the takedowns early, and win that first round pretty clearly. So I don't think it's completely outside the realm of possibility here to see McCann, somehow be able to keep it standing long enough in 2 of the 3 rounds to be able to, just outwork Blanchfield in those spots. That said, I still think that Blanchfield is the side here. I feel like she is going to be able to get her grappling going and eventually find the submission against McCann. I'm going to go with Blanchfield. Round 2 submission. I think she's going to look to aggressively push the grappling this fight. McCann might be able to stuff the first couple, but I do think that eventually this fight hits the ground, and I do think there's a big enough difference in terms of maybe the skill and the physicality on the mat that we see Blanchfield find the submission. So official pick, I'm going to go with Blanchfield to win by round 2 submission. And next up, we have Ryan Spann versus Dominick Reyes. And Reyes is the minus 220 favorite. Spann is the plus 185 underdog. And Reyes is going to be making his return after getting pretty brutally knocked out by Prochazka. It is good to see him take that time off. It does look like he's switched camps as well. So I feel like he is doing the right things. It is tough to bounce back from this sort of skid. He was someone who did have a ton of hype on him. He did almost reach the top of the sport, went to a draw with the greatest light heavyweight of all time, arguably won that fight, but then goes on to get knocked out in 2 consecutive fights. So, I feel that's got to take a pretty big mental toll on you, but it does look like Reyes, I feel, is doing all the right things to get back. Like, he's not rushing back. He's looking to get his health in order. He's switching camps. He's working with high-level guys like Pereira and Glover. And Reyes, he still is pretty young. I do think that he's got a pretty bright future ahead of him still. And overall, I do think he's got a decent foundation to build off of. He's a good striker with decent power. I know he's coming off of 2 knockouts, but I'd still say that Reyes should still be pretty durable. He was taking some pretty insane punishment from Prochazka before that, spinning elbow took him out. But I feel his chin should still be intact. But, beyond that, Reyes, he does have pretty good cardio. He can push a pretty solid pace. And I do think, he still has a decent future in the UFC. But the problem is, Spann, I think, is actually a pretty tough opponent to have a bounce back fight against. Spann, he is a somewhat inconsistent fighter, but I do think he's still quite dangerous. Spann, obviously, he's got power in his hands. He's pretty big for the division, a very big frame. He also has a very dangerous and sneaky guillotine. Obviously, he can snatch it up against guys who are shooting sloppy takedowns or guys that he's able to hurt. And he's able to just kind of club and sub in there. So, Spann, he is a pretty dangerous fighter, but the issue with him is a couple of things. One is, he will slow down in fights. He's pretty front-loaded with a lot of his wins. We did see Spann go to a split decision against Sam Alvey. Not a particularly great look. And Spann also has got a weird tendency to just get elbowed to the side of the head and get finished. So I don't have the most trust in Spann, but I do have to admit he is still a pretty dangerous fighter. But at the end of the day, I think I got to go with Reyes here. I think that what it comes down to is just the pace and the pressure and the aggression that Reyes brings in this fight. I think if he's able to make it past that first round, I think he can really put it on Spann. Spann, in my opinion, is just not a 3-round fighter. I think he could have success early, but I feel if he isn't able to get Reyes out of there, I think Reyes is able to really just outpace him and outwork him in the latter 2 rounds. Maybe even find the finish. That said, I don't know if I could really get to Reyes at this price, though. At almost a bit over 2-1 favorite. I just don't know if I could really lay that against someone one as dangerous as Spann, and the fact is Reyes he hasn't won a fight in 3 years, which admittedly it is a somewhat cherry-picked stat. He did go up against some, very high-level guys, championship caliber guys in Jones and in Yan and Prochaska. But the fact remains, Reyes, he hasn't won a fight in over 3 years. There are potential questions as to how he's going to look, after coming off of just 2 pretty nasty knockouts. You have to wonder how his mentality is going to be in there, what he's going to look like physically as well, because that is a pretty brutal knockout to be coming back from, if he's going to be maybe a little gun-shy going into this fight. So just a lot of, potential red flags on the Reyes side to be laying, this big price on him. But I do think he gets it done here. I'm going to go with Reyes to win by round 2 knockout. I suspect Reyes may need to take that first round to really get his feet under him. And, Spann, he is probably going to throw some heat early too. So Reyes will probably have to be a little more defensive in that first round. But I see him getting into the groove of it a little later into round 1. I think he'll have to build into a little bit. And I think we see that momentum kind of carry into the second round. We start to see him, have a lot more success with the hands and eventually find the knockout over Spann. So I'm going to go with Reyes. I'm going to go with Reyes to win by round 2 knockout. And next up, we have Brad Riddell versus Renato Moicano. And Moicano's the minus 125 favorite. Riddell's the plus 105 underdog. And we'll start with them first. So Riddell, very technical kickboxer. He's had a pretty insane strength of schedule since coming to the UFC. He's fought guys like Jalen Turner, Fiziev, Malarkey, Dober, De Silva, Mustafayev. So, very respectable resume here. He's fought a ton of very dangerous, very skilled fighters. A lot of guys who are unranked and don't have a ton of name value too. So, much respect to Riddell, but I feel like his management's got to step it up a little bit moving forward. But as far as what Riddell does bring to the table, he is a very good striker. He's very good defensively. The volume is solid from him. He can go 3 hard rounds. He does a decent job of keeping the fight standing. He has been taken down. He has been controlled, but by and large, he's done a pretty good job of keeping it standing and winning in the striking exchanges. Overall, I do think that Riddell's a pretty solid fighter. He just ran into a couple potential contenders in Jalen Turner and Rafael Fiziev. So very tough outs for anyone. And he's got another pretty tough matchup here in Moicano. So Moicano, this guy's actually a pretty well-rounded fighter. I think his Muay Thai is actually pretty underrated. The only issue with Moicano on the feet is, he can get a little lax there. He can get clipped. He can get knocked out. But offensively speaking, I do think his Muay Thai is quite serviceable. On top of that, he does have a pretty dangerous submission game. The wrestling is decent from Moicano. The only issue is, he can just get maybe a little defensively lax on the feet. And, he does tend to slow down a little bit in fights. And it's not even the worst thing ever. I feel like it really only happens when he's pushing a pretty aggressive grappling pace. But if it's a striking affair, I don't think he'll have any issues going 3 rounds. But taking a look at this matchup, it is a pretty interesting one. Riddell obviously wants to keep it standing. I definitely see Riddell having the advantage there. I can see him pulling ahead in extended striking exchanges. Obviously Moicano, no slouch on the feet, but defensively, I do favor Riddell a lot more. And I feel like over the course of 15 minutes, if they're just striking in there, I see Riddell being able to land the much cleaner shots, the much more damaging shots. Obviously, Moicano's got the wrestling he can mix in. He can mix in the grappling. I do give him a pretty significant edge there. And overall, I do think that Moicano's the more well-rounded fighter. But I just feel that Riddell does a pretty good job of keeping the fight standing. And I do think that Riddell has a big enough advantage on the feet that he could pull away and win minutes standing. He may even be able to find the chin of Moicano. Moicano does float his chin out there, but Riddell, I don't know if he's got the most power, but I feel like if he is knocking Moicano down or out, it's probably going to be from just landing a clean shot more so from landing a hard shot. So I think that is potentially live. I think Riddell has a bit more knockdown and knockout upside. Another factor I think may come into play here is I just think that Riddell's got slightly better cardio. I feel like that first round Moicano may have some success mixing in the wrestling and grappling, but down the stretch I see Riddell having an easier time stuffing the takedowns, working his way back up and getting his striking going. So I do like Riddell in this spot. Not extremely confident because I do think both guys are really good fighters. I think Moicano's the more well-rounded guy, but I just think that Riddell's going to be able to keep it standing long enough to win at least 2 of the 3 rounds here. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Riddell to win by a very competitive 29-28 decision. And up next, we have Dan Hooker versus Claudio Puelles. And Hooker's the -170 favorite. Puelles is the +145 underdog. And we'll start with the veteran in Hooker first. So Hooker in a pretty weird spot career-wise. He's 1-4 in his last 5, getting finished in 3 of those fights. Granted, it is against really high-level guys at the top of the division, championship level guys, but the trajectory honestly isn't looking great for him. This is a pretty big step down in competition for Hooker, but also a pretty risky fight in that he's really gonna have to get a win here to hold his ranking. So I feel like the pressure might be on for Hooker in this spot. But Hooker, we kind of know what he does well in here. He's a striker who likes to get in your face, pressure you, back you down. He's got great kicks at distance. He's someone who could fight pretty well in both stances. He's got decent power considering the volume he pushes. He's very big for the division. He's got a pretty sneaky knee up the middle. He's been in there with some very tough guys, very high-level guys, and it looks like the UFC is giving him a bit of a step down, a potential break from all these killers he's been going up against. But stylistically, this is a pretty interesting matchup because he's going up against Puelles, who is primarily a submission grappler. A guy who's got very limited stand-up. Puelles, he is very slippery, very tricky on the mat. He's got a very a slick knee bar that he likes to attack. But I think what makes this matchup, very interesting is that outside of the Makhachev fight, Hooker really hasn't fought a ton of dedicated grapplers. He did get taken down, I think, by Jason Knight a number of times and held down a long time ago, but that was a while ago. That was down at 145. But beyond that, Hooker really hasn't had his grappling defense tested that much. He hasn't had his takedown defense really tested that much either. So it is a little tricky in that regard, but I am pretty confident that Hooker's going to be the significantly better striker. Puelles still doesn't seem all that comfortable on the feet, and more importantly, I just think that Puelles is very slow and very hittable in there. I didn't really like what I saw on the feet from Puelles against guys like Guida and Gritzmacher. 2 older guys who aren't really strikers, so I think this is going to be a very tough fight on the feet for Puelles. If Puelles is somehow able to get on top of Hooker, he could make things really interesting, but the issue is Puelles, he just has very sloppy takedowns. His shots are very telegraphed. I'm watching this fight against Guida, or not Guida, but Gritzmacher, and he's shooting from a mile out. It's very telegraphed, and I feel like the reason he was able to convert some of those takedowns was because he's up against just older, slower fighters as well. I think he's going to have a much harder time against a guy like Hooker who, he's on a rough skid, but I feel like Hooker still is in his prime, if not the tail end of his prime. Hooker is also going to be a very big, strong guy compared to some of the older fighters that Puelles has gone up against. On top of that, Hooker's also far more dangerous on the feet than guys like Guida and Jordan Levitt and Gritzmacher. I think that the knee up the middle for Hooker is pretty live as well, especially with how telegraphed some of the shots that Puelles is shooting in there. I think Hooker could definitely time him with something, just knee him in the face. I think this is a very winnable fight for Hooker. I think this is a big enough step down in competition that he should be able to handle someone like Puelles, I feel. I still think that Hooker's got a bit more left in the tank. He just had some really, really tough matchups. There still are some question marks going into this matchup. Mainly the submission defense of Hooker. He hasn't really fought someone with a slick knee bar, heel hook game like Puelles. We're gonna have to see how he defends against some of these attempts. But outside of that, I feel like it's Dan Hooker all day. I think if he's able to keep the standing, he's going to be able to do some pretty serious damage to Puelles. Puelles does a decent job of, clinching up, tying up with opponents, and making it a very sloppy, grindy fight, but he's going to have to do it against a veteran in Dan Hooker, who's also got a pretty significant edge on the feet as well. So I got to go with Hooker in this spot. Outside of Puelles pulling off a knee bar or something, I don't know if he's going to have too much success. I think Hooker is going to keep this fight standing. I think he's going to do some serious damage on the feet. Win by decision, maybe even a knockout. Because I do feel that there is a big enough gap on the feet that I could see Puelles, I could see Puelles getting hurt pretty badly. The only thing is, he might not follow Puelles to the ground if he does hurt him. He might just be a little wary of the submission game and just let him stand back up and kind of just beat him up on the feet and win a pretty clear decision that way. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Dan Hooker to win by decision. And next up, we have Chris Gutierrez versus Frankie Edgar. And Gutierrez is the minus 210 favorite. Edgar's the plus 180 underdog. And we'll start with the veteran in Edgar first. So, Edgar making his return after getting his head punted off by Chito Vera. And I guess that was a year ago. It doesn't feel that long, but it does look like it's actually been exactly a year off. So I guess that's good. But at the end of the day, I really don't know if that's something you could really, truly recover from. But skill-wise, Edgar does still seem like a solid fighter. Even in the Vera fight, he did have his moments. The wrestling was on point. His striking was solid. He still looked like he had pretty quick hands, pretty good movement, a good combination punching. But at the end of the day, he did get his head punted into the fifth row. And you do have to wonder, at this stage in his career, how well is that durability going to hold up, and the cardio as well, because I think part of the reason that Edgar got caught in his last fight was he was slowing down in that fight. He was pushing a pretty wrestle-heavy game plan, and at 41 years old, it doesn't matter, how athletic you are, how great of a wrestler you are, back in the day. It is going to tax the cardio, and I feel like part of the reason he did get caught there was because he was slowing down. He was getting a little easier to pinpoint, and Vera was able to land a pretty clean kick to the face, right? So there's those concerns with Edgar. And then on top of that, this is going to be his retirement fight, and those hardly ever go well. Just a lot of red flags on the Edgar side. But I feel like the UFC is giving him a winnable matchup here, right? Because, I feel like if there's anyone he could still pull it off against, that's still a respectable opponent, it's got to be Gutierrez, I feel, because, Gutierrez, he is a solid fighter. He is someone who's got a really good kicking game. He will chop at the legs. He will slam those body kicks, but he doesn't really throw his hands. And outside of him landing a head kick or something, I don't know if Gutierrez has a ton of knockout upside. And on top of that, the takedown defense of Gutierrez isn't that great. The grappling's not that great. We've seen a ton of guys have success taking Gutierrez down, controlling him, whether it's up against the cage or on the mat. He's been submitted before, got submitted by Barcelos, went to a draw with Durden on the basis of just giving up a whole round, getting backpacked. Arguably not a 10-8 round, but the fact that he just got backpacked and really wasn't doing anything that whole round is not great. It went to split with the likes of Colares and De Freitas because they were able to mix in the grappling and rack up some control time. So I feel like there is a path here for Edgar. Obviously, there's a decent chance he might just get folded early in a fight, but I feel like if he doesn't, he's, I'd say, the more well-rounded fighter. I actually think that Edgar, outside of maybe the kicking game, is the better fighter pretty much everywhere. It's just that he is old. He has been knocked out pretty badly on a few occasions already. He's also 41 years old at bantamweight, which is extremely old. I mean, it's old regardless of the weight class, but especially so at 135. It's also going to be his retirement fight, so a lot of red flags on the Edgar side, but I think I'm still going to pick him to win here. I know it doesn't happen too much, but I do think we see Edgar ride off into the sunset with a W here. I think he's going to have a bit of success with the takedowns. I think he's going to be able to get some top control time. He's going to be the local guy as well. I think the crowd's going to be behind him. I think it's going to be a bit of, just a feel-good story, and I think he's going to win a very close split decision here. So I'm going to go with Edgar to pull off the upset and ride off into the sunset with a W. And give me Edgar by decision. And next up, we have Michael Chandler versus Dustin Poirier. And Poirier is the minus 175 favorite. Chandler's the plus 150 underdog. And this is a great fight, guys. I think the matchmaking for Chandler has just been top-notch lately. He's been in nothing but bangers at the UFC level. And same can be said about Dustin. Dustin, I don't think, has been in any boring fights. So I'm pretty confident this fight is going to deliver. I think we're going to have an absolute banger of a fight here. So let's get right into the breakdown. Poirier, in my opinion, I think it's pretty safe to say he is probably the best striker in the division, if not the most proven. I know there are some up-and-comers like Fiziev that could probably challenge for that title, but just as far as the level of competition that Dustin Poirier's been in there with, the longevity that he's had, I think it's safe to say he's the best, if not one of the best strikers in the division. I mean, just a quick glance at his record. He's outstruck guys like Conor McGregor, Dan Hooker, Gaethje, Alvarez, Holloway. I mean, just talk about a guy paying his dues. I think Dustin's a guy who's done that. And he's got a very exciting style as well. He likes to go in there. He's got a modified Philly shell that he fights out of. He's very scrappy. He's got very high output, and he's looking to pressure opponents. He's constantly putting something out there. I'd say he still is pretty tough. He has been hurt. He has been knocked out before, but, he's shown pretty good recoverability in there. And overall, I still think his chin is still pretty solid. The cardio also checks out. We've seen Poirier fight 5 pretty hard rounds before, so 3 rounds really shouldn't be much of an issue for him. The defensive grappling's going to lose him some fights here and there, but I don't think it's going to be a massive factor here. But the big narrative surrounding Dustin is, I feel like, going to be the potential durability concerns. Not so much that, he's chinny or anything, but the fact that he has been in a ton of wars, win or lose. The guy takes a ton of damage in his fights, and that is something that is going to catch up to you. I don't know if it's this fight, but, if there's anyone that is going to be able to take advantage, it's got to be a big, explosive puncher in Chandler. And Chandler is someone who will swing for the fences early. He is someone who will aggressively go for it if he does sense blood in the water. So Chandler, I feel, does have a pretty good chance of finding the knockout early, but ultimately, I just don't know how much win equity Chandler's got outside of that early knockout. He could potentially wrestle. That is something that has been, I'd say, one of Poirier's bigger weaknesses. And Chandler, he is a pretty good wrestler, but the thing is, he hasn't really shown much interest in pushing it at the UFC level. He did mix it in against Ferguson at the end of the first round, but I feel like that was because he was getting outstruck on the feet, and he just needed to kind of recuperate a little bit. He was getting hurt. So, I don't think the wrestling is going to be his primary game plan. I feel like Chandler is going to come for war. And I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I feel like Chandler's prerogative coming into the UFC is to just put on, fun, exciting fights. He's supposedly getting paid a lot, compared to the rest of the roster. He's got, somewhat preferential treatment. So, he's going to come in here, and I think he's going to put on his show, make the fans happy, make Dana happy. And to do that, he's going to come in and he's going to look to take the head off of a legend in Poirier. So I do expect this to largely be a stand-up affair. And I kind of see it playing out kind of similar to the Chandler-Gaethje fight, right, where I think Chandler is going to start out kind of hot early. He might be able to land some big shots on Poirier. But overall, I just think that Poirier is going to be the better striker, better technically, better defensively. I think overall the striking of Poirier is a little more varied, a little more layered. And I just think that his approach is a little more structured, whereas with Chandler, he's got that big power, but overall, I find his striking to be rather simple. It's kind of really just meat and potatoes in there. And on top of that, Chandler doesn't seem to really pace himself all that well. He is pretty front-loaded with his success and approach to fights. He slows down pretty significantly in the second and third rounds. We saw in the Gaethje fight, he looked good in that first round, started to taper off a bit in that second, and then pretty much had nothing in the tank come that third round. Had to resort to kind of just taunting Gaethje and negging him on instead of, throwing strikes. So, the guy was just completely gassed there. So it's kind of hard to watch that performance and not come away being a bit more on the Poirier side for this fight. I think Dustin's just a way more defensive fighter than someone like Gaethje, who's going to kind of just get in your face and brawl with you. I feel like Poirier is a little more methodical with his pressure. So the official pick for this fight, I do have to go with Dustin here to pick up the W. I am probably oversimplifying it a little bit, but I do think that if Poirier is able to not get knocked out in that first round, he should be able to take over in the second and third, kind of similar to what Gaethje did. Dustin may even be able to find the knockout later in the fight, but I'm not gonna count Chandler's chin out after seeing him go to war with Gaethje. So the official pick, I'm gonna go with Dustin here to get the dub. I think he either gets it done by round 3 knockout or a decision, but official pick, I guess I'll just go with Dustin to win by decision. And in the co-main event, we have Zhang Weili versus Carla Esparza. And Weili's the minus 325 favorite. Esparza's the plus 275 underdog. And this is a very interesting fight, right? On one hand, I do think this is probably one of the more disrespectful lines in a title fight, right? The champ being a plus 300 underdog is a little ridiculous. She was an even bigger underdog, I think, a little earlier in the week, earlier last week also. But on the other hand, you look at Esparza's run, and while the names are pretty impressive, I feel like the run itself has actually been somewhat improbable. I feel like Esparza's gotten some pretty good bounces that have gone her way, and it's happened in consecutive fights. But just taking a quick look over at her streak, she's got a majority decision win over Grasso, a split decision win over Watterson, a split decision win over Rodriguez, and a split decision win over Namajunas. So, I feel like she's been really fortunate to get a ton of these split decisions. She's got pretty favorable bounces. I feel like a number of these fights could have gone the other way. But at the end of the day, Esparza has been able to pull off these wins. And I feel like you still have to give her a bit of credit for that, right? Because it's not like she's getting completely blown out. She's able to hang in these fights and get the nod in these decisions. And I do have to admit that does have to count for something, but I just feel like it might not translate too well into this matchup because the fact of the matter is, I'd say outside of the wrestling, I feel like Weili's pretty much better everywhere. She's going to be the much more physical fighter in there. She's the way better striker. She's a lot more well-rounded also. On top of that, Weili's got a lot more 5-round experience. And I mean actual 5-round experience where she's gone out there and fought 5 hard rounds. She's gone to war. And just in terms of the grappling, I'd even say the top side offense of Weili's even better than Esparza's. Esparza, in my opinion, is more of a lay and pray sort of fighter, whereas Weili, if she's able to get on top of you, she's actually doing work there. People are looking at the Joanna fight where, she's able to kind of maul Joanna in there. But even before that, she's shown flashes of it, right? Against Torres, against Aguilar. Weili's just smashing these girls on top. She's mauling them. And that was a time when I feel like Weili's game's a little more unrefined as well, which brings me to my next point. Weili's actually been showing improvements to her game since coming to the UFC. She was billed as more so of a striker, a technical brawler, I guess, but we've seen her really level up in the wrestling, in the grappling her last few fights. She's out here. She's working with high-level guys like Cejudo to round out her game. So overall, I just like the skill set that Weili's got. I like her mindset, her willingness to want to grow, fight to fight. So you combine that with her just being the larger, more physical athlete. I feel like Weili's just got a ton of advantages here. That said, I don't want to completely write Esparza off because, she has found ways to win. She does have a legitimate skill set in her wrestling, and she knows how to, mix it in to win. She knows how to fight to her strengths. So overall, I do feel there is a path for Esparza. It's just that I think it's a bit narrow. But just diving into it a little bit further, just going over, potential paths to victory for Esparza outside of something crazy happening like an illegal knee or an injury or an eye poke or something like that. Her most likely paths are, she's got a couple actually. I'd say one of them is, she's able to hit takedowns and rack up top control time in 3 of the 5 rounds and be able to win a decision that way, which, is definitely a possibility, but I think it's going to be really tough because if you look at some of Esparza's previous performances, she's been able to hit takedowns and rack up top control time in about 2 of the 3 rounds. That's kind of how she's been winning her fights on her run. But in a lot of these fights, she's not really winning these rounds very clearly. A lot of it, she's just kind of laying on top of opponents. Judges aren't convinced she's winning these rounds, very convincingly, which is why she's got all these split decisions, majority decisions and such. And beyond that, Carla has actually slowed down in some of the fights where she's pushed a wrestle-heavy pace. She's actually been 10-8'd before in the 3rd round. So, you do have to wonder how the cardio is going to look for Esparza, especially over the course of 5 rounds. You have to wonder if she's got the cardio to wrestle for 3 hard rounds and win those rounds convincingly, and also not get 10-8'd or finished in the latter rounds, if he does start to slow down. So overall, I feel like a lot of things have to go right for Esparza to have to win a decision here. But something else that could maybe happen is maybe if, Weili punches herself out early, or if she starts out a little too aggressive. We see her tire herself out in the first couple of rounds and not have much left in the tank, and she ends up dropping the later rounds. That could be another path to victory here for Esparza. We did see in the fight against Rose with Weili that she did kind of drop the championship rounds on the basis of being taken down and not working her way back up. She was throwing strikes from bottom, but the judges just did not score that in her favor. And I feel like maybe if Weili pushes too high of a pace early, she could end up giving up takedowns later in the fight and getting top time that way. And the reason I kind of bring up this scenario is because, I'm watching Weili's fight against Joanna, and, she starts off very aggressively, and she was able to find the finish in the 2nd round, but that's not really a sort of pace you could really sustain in a 5-round fight. So if Weili comes in here and she disrespects Esparza, I think she could just get Esparza out of there early. It could backfire on her, but I just don't think either of those scenarios are too likely. I think Weili's too smart of a fighter to come in fighting like that. And, I just think that Weili's really just got Esparza pretty much outgunned everywhere. I think that on the feet, there's a big striking advantage, big strength advantage. I think that Weili could absolutely just pummel Esparza standing. I think that Weili can probably even maul Esparza on the ground too. Esparza is a good offensive wrestler, but her takedown defense actually isn't that great. We've seen her get manhandled by a better wrestler and grapplers before, fighters that have also been a little more physical than her. So I can see Weili having success there, putting Esparza on her back. So overall, I really just think that Weili can get it done however she wants. She can get the knockout standing. She can get the knockout on the mat, TKO stoppage. Maybe even find the submission. I think she could win a decision as well. So, I just think there are a ton of paths there for Weili. I feel like it is her fight to lose. So for that reason, I got to go with Weili in this spot here. Official pick, I'm going to pick her to win by round 2 knockout. I think that Esparza is going to be pretty screwed if she's not able to get this fight to the ground. She might have some success early, but I think that Weili is going to put up a lot of resistance. She's going to land some hard shots, and I think the cumulative damage is going to add up come that 2nd round. So give me Weili here. Give me Weili to win by round 2 knockout. And in the main event, we have Israel Adesanya versus Alex Pereira. And Adesanya is going to be the minus 170 favorite. Pereira's the plus 145 underdog. And I actually think this is going to be a pretty good main event. I know a lot of people are of the opinion that Izzy's a pretty boring champ. He's very risk averse. Not a ton of very exciting fights. And that maybe Pereira doesn't really deserve the title shot either, which, I don't necessarily disagree with, but I do think this is a pretty compelling matchup. These guys, they have fought before. They have history with each other. So there's that narrative. And I do feel like this is a somewhat narrative-driven breakdown because we don't have too much to work with on the Pereira side as far as MMA bouts go. He's only had 7 MMA fights, 3 at the UFC level, and most of his fights are finishing inside the distance. So we don't have a ton of MMA footage to work with. Obviously, he does have a pretty extensive kickboxing career, and this likely will be a striking affair, but there are differences between the sports. So obviously, outside of the mixed martial arts aspect of it, we're working with smaller gloves here. We're in a cage. The clinch work is much different. So it's not a direct translation, although, a lot of their skill sets are going to carry over. And just given that, I feel like you do have to favor Izzy a little bit more for those reasons because Izzy's just had a lot more octagon time. He's a lot more familiar, I'd say, with mixed martial arts striking. And I know Pereira technically is 2-0 over Izzy, but, rewatching those fights, I feel like the first one was very competitive. Both guys had their moments. A lot of people thought Izzy won, but this isn't something I'm going to go out in there and debate, but I do feel the big takeaway here is, both guys are at a pretty similar level. Even in the second fight up until the knockout, it was a very competitive fight. Pereira was landing some good shots. It looked like Izzy may have had Pereira on the ropes at one point. Ultimately, Izzy did get caught, and at the end of the day, he is 0-2 against Pereira, but I feel like it's a little more nuanced than that, and I think the fact that this is taking place as a mixed martial arts fight in the octagon, I think does favor Izzy a little bit more. Izzy also has a lot more 5-round experience at the UFC level. Pereira, he has gone 5 rounds before in kickboxing, but not in mixed martial arts, and kickboxing rounds are actually 3 minutes as opposed to mixed martial arts rounds, which are 5-minute rounds. So Izzy's going to have, I'd say, a pretty significant experience advantage there in regards to being able to go 25 minutes. Izzy, he has actually been scheduled for 8 5-rounders, I believe, and 6 of them have actually gone the distance. So, he's got a ton of time. He knows how to pace himself in 5-rounders. He's no stranger to these, 5-round title fights, whereas with Pereira, this is going to be a pretty new experience for him. And, of course, Izzy's just got a lot more experience in terms of MMA striking, fighting in the 4-ounce gloves. And on top of that, I'd say between the two, Izzy's probably still a bit closer to his prime than Pereira. Not to say Pereira's washed or anything. I still think Pereira's still a top-shelf athlete, but I think between the two, Izzy's probably a little closer to where his prime would be at. So yeah, you take all these factors, and I feel like all these little advantages for Izzy kind of add up, and it leads to him being a slight to moderate favorite here. And, I can understand people on the Pereira side. Pereira did technically beat Izzy twice, one by knockout, once by decision, but I feel like the situation's not really the same here. I really do think that the experience that Izzy's accrued at the UFC level is going to really help him pull away here. I don't think it'll be super apparent pre-fight, but I think these are things that will kind of show itself once they're in there. However, I do think it's going to be a pretty competitive fight because, the two things that Izzy's really kind of held over his opponents is his height and his striking ability. Just two things that he has a pretty clear advantage over most of the division. But in this fight, obviously you won't have those here. Pereira is going to be able to match him in the size. As far as his frame goes, I think he's like the same size as Izzy. Just two very big middleweights in there. And secondly, obviously he does have the very high level kickboxing background. So I suspect it's going to be a little harder for Izzy to fight like he usually does against some of the other guys in the division who, aren't as big as him, who aren't quite as skilled as him. He's able to kind of stay on the outside, kind of point fight and counter. But in this fight, I don't think it's going to be that easy. I think we see Izzy actually maybe look to lead the dance a little bit more. get his hands going a little bit more in this fight. And I feel if it's anything like either of the first two fights, I think we're going to be in for a pretty good time. But as far as an official pick goes, I think I got to go with Izzy here to win a very competitive decision. I think it just comes down to that extra bit of experience when it comes to the MMA striking. The fact that Izzy's just a little younger as well, I think puts him over the edge here for me. So give me Izzy by decision. And that'll do it for this episode of the podcast. Don't really have too much to add here, honestly on a bit of a time crunch, but just wanted to get a bit of content out for one of the bigger cards of the year. It's going to be a good one, guys. I'm really looking forward to this one. Super stacked card. Lots of great matchups. It's going to be a fun one. But best of luck with your guys' picks and bets. I likely won't be back in time for the Lewis Spivak card. So this will be a little bit of a hiatus, but after that, I expect to be back on schedule and be turning out content on a weekly basis for each of these cards. So yeah, best of luck with your guys' picks and bets, and I'll likely catch you guys for the card after the Lewis Spivak one.